The 1970s were a strange decade for cars. The oil crisis, strict emissions laws, and awkward styling experiments created some of the most disappointing vehicles ever to hit the road. While a few 70s models became legends, many others turned out slow, unreliable, and downright embarrassing. These were the cars that promised excitement but delivered frustration, the ones history would rather forget. Here are the top 13 worst cars of the 1970s, machines that defined the decade for all the wrong reasons. Stick around till the end, and don't forget to subscribe.
The Oldsmobile Omega, sold from 1973 through 1979, is one of those cars that reminds us of just how badly General Motors misunderstood the American buyer during the mid-1970s. On paper, it should have been a clever idea. GM had its X-body platform, the Chevrolet Nova, Buick Apollo, Pontiac Ventura, and finally, the Oldsmobile Omega. The thought was simple. Take the popular Nova, give it a little bit of Oldsmobile flair, and sell it to customers who wanted Olds prestige, but in a smaller, more fuel-conscious package. It was marketed as a sort of junior Cutlass, a more refined, compact car, wearing the Oldsmobile nameplate. The trouble was, the Omega wasn't really an Oldsmobile at all. It was, quite transparently, just a Nova with different badges and trim. And that's where the story of disappointment begins. Buyers who walked into Oldsmobile dealerships expecting an upgrade in quality were shocked to find that the Omega carried over all of the Nova's rough edges, but charged a premium price for them. The interiors, which should have been plush and sophisticated to justify the Oldsmobile badge, were flimsy, rattly, and uninspired. The vinyl upholstery cracked early, the plastic trim felt cheap, and squeaks and rattles were common within the first year of ownership. Compared to the lush, roomy Oldsmobile Cutlass Supreme sitting in the same showroom, one of the best-selling cars in America during the 70s, the Omega looked and felt like a cruel joke. Owners thought they were stepping into a luxury compact, but many quickly realized they'd just been sold a dressed-up Nova, and not even a particularly good one. Mechanically, the car suffered from the same issues that plagued most Novas of the time. Base Omegas came with Chevrolet's workaday inline-six engines, the 250 cubic inch six-cylinder being the most common, which were durable enough, but sounded coarse and delivered little in the way of refinement. Buyers could option a V8, but even then, the small block Chevys stuffed into the Omega didn't feel smooth or premium. Oldsmobile enthusiasts noticed immediately that these weren't Olds rocket V8s, but Chevy power plants. It was one of the earliest, clearest examples of GM's cost-cutting corporate engine-sharing policy, and Oldsmobile loyalists were furious. Many had been drawn to Olds for its smooth, torquey, rocket engines, only to discover that their Omega had the heart of a budget Chevrolet. This led to bitter complaints and even brand defections, as customers felt misled. Road manners were no better. The Omega's suspension was harsh, the steering vague, and the handling felt far from sporty or refined. What Oldsmobile tried to market as an upscale compact often drove like a worn-out taxi. Owners frequently complained of poor build quality, doors that didn't line up, weather stripping that leaked, and electrical gremlins that showed up early in the car's life. Rust resistance was minimal, so in the harsh winters of the Midwest and Northeast, these cars dissolved quickly, sometimes within 5 years of purchase. The worst part of the Omega's legacy was the betrayal of expectations. Chevrolet buyers knew what they were getting with a Nova, a cheap, bare-bones, honest compact car that could be abused and still run. Oldsmobile buyers, however, walked in expecting refinement, a touch of class, maybe a compact car that still carried Oldsmobile's mid-tier prestige. Instead, they got the same mediocrity at a higher price, packaged with a badge that promised something it couldn't deliver. One bitter owner wrote in a 1970s newspaper review, "I bought an Oldsmobile, but I got a Chevrolet, and not a very good Chevrolet." That summed up the Omega's reputation perfectly. By the end of its run in 1979, the Omega had gained a reputation as one of GM's most cynical exercises in badge engineering. While the Nova soldiered on with a reputation as a basic, dependable commuter car, the Omega was remembered as a fraud, a car that tried to sell cheap underpinnings as luxury. Collectors today mostly ignore it, and surviving examples often languish in junkyards or pop up as curiosities at small-town car shows, usually mocked as one of GM's biggest missteps of the decade. The Oldsmobile Omega stands today as a cautionary tale about brand dilution. Oldsmobile, which once represented solid engineering and quiet prestige, damaged its image by slapping its badge on what was essentially a down-market product. It was a car that looked like an Olds, was priced like an Olds, but drove like a Chevrolet Nova in its cheapest trim. For those who lived through it, the Omega remains a symbol of disappointment, a lemon disguised in fake luxury. Would you like me to expand even further and weave in multiple angry owner anecdotes, comparisons to its platform siblings Nova, Ventura, Apollo, and how the Omega helped erode Oldsmobile's reputation, leading towards its eventual demise in 2004? That could turn this into a much richer and dramatic story of betrayal and decline.
The Mercury Bobcat, sold from 1974 through 1980, was one of the most cynical products Ford ever pushed out the door. On the surface, it was marketed as a stylish, upscale compact for Mercury, a smaller, fuel-efficient car that still offered some of the brand's traditional refinement. In reality, it was nothing more than a Ford Pinto with a different grille, some extra chrome, and slightly upgraded interior trim. That alone might have been forgivable if the Pinto hadn't already become infamous nationwide for its catastrophic design flaw, the tendency of its fuel tank to rupture and ignite in rear-end collisions. By the time the Bobcat appeared, everyone knew about the Pinto scandal, and trying to pass off essentially the same car as a luxury compact was like putting a bow tie on a time bomb. The whole idea behind the Bobcat was pure badge engineering, and Mercury buyers quickly realized it. Instead of developing a proper compact car that could stand apart from Ford's economy offering, the company just took a Pinto, swapped in a slightly different front fascia, dressed up the dashboard with faux wood and a bit of extra vinyl, and called it a Mercury. The trouble was that Mercury's customer base expected more. They weren't walking into Mercury showrooms for a rebadged EconoBox. They were looking for something smaller, yes, but still polished, sophisticated, and worthy of a Mercury badge. What they got instead was a Pinto in disguise, complete with the same rattly engines, cheap sheet metal, and fire-prone gas tank. The interiors were a cruel joke. Ford tried to pass off vinyl seats with slightly fancier stitching and fake wood trim as upscale, but the plastics cracked early, the seats wore down quickly, and the cars developed squeaks and rattles that made them feel like beaters even when new. Owners reported constant problems with trim pieces falling off, headliners sagging, and dashboards warping under the sun. For a car that was supposed to be Mercury's entry into the compact luxury segment, the Bobcat looked and felt like a secondhand special from the bargain lot. And then there was the elephant in the room: safety. Everyone knew about the Pinto's exploding fuel tank by the mid-1970s. Lawsuits, news reports, and consumer advocacy groups had made the car a national punchline. Ford's attempt to market the Bobcat as something better only backfired, because once buyers realized it was just a Pinto with extra chrome, the association was immediate. People joked that Mercury stood for more explosions, reliable car you'll avoid totally. One exasperated owner was quoted in a period newspaper saying, "I paid extra for the Bobcat thinking I was getting something nicer. Turns out I just paid extra for the same fire hazard." That was the story repeated again and again: disappointment, frustration, and embarrassment. Mechanically, the Bobcat offered nothing special. Base models came with the same wheezy four-cylinder engines as the Pinto, struggling to make barely 90 horsepower on a good day. Acceleration was glacial, the transmissions were crude, and the suspension delivered all the refinement of a shopping cart. Road tests from the era described the Bobcat as sluggish, underpowered, and uncomfortable on long drives. Even when optioned with a V6 in later years, it was still hopelessly outdated and inferior to what Japanese imports like the Toyota Corolla and Datsun F10 were offering at the same price point. Buyers looking for economy found better, more reliable options in imports. Buyers looking for luxury were insulted by the Bobcat's cheapness.
That left the car in an awkward middle ground where it failed to appeal to anyone. By the late 1970s, the Mercury Bobcat had cemented itself as a rolling punchline. It became shorthand for corporate laziness, badge engineering at its worst, and the dangers of trying to dress up a fundamentally bad product as something respectable. Collectors today rarely even acknowledge the Bobcat, except as a curiosity or a reminder of how low Mercury sank in the era. Surviving examples are usually derelict, rusted, or relegated to Pinto enthusiast oddity circles. Nobody seriously restores them, and when one shows up at a car show, it's more likely to spark laughter than admiration. In hindsight, the Mercury Bobcat wasn't just a bad car, it was an insult to Mercury's customers. It tried to trick buyers into thinking they were getting a safe, upscale compact, when in reality they were paying extra for one of the most infamous lemons of the 1970s. It shared the Pinto's cheap bones, the Pinto's poor driving dynamics, and worst of all, the Pinto's explosive reputation. No amount of chrome or fake wood could disguise that fact. The Bobcat is remembered today not as a serious car in Mercury's lineup, but as a cynical rebadge of a death trap, a luxury Pinto nobody asked for and few wanted to admit they bought. Would you like me to expand this even further into an ultra-detailed takedown with period magazine reviews, lawsuits, crash test anecdotes, and comparisons to competitors that absolutely embarrassed it? The Pontiac Astre, built from 1975 to 1977, was one of General Motors' most blatant exercises in badge engineering gone wrong. On paper, Pontiac was desperate for a small car in the US market, something to compete with the tidal wave of reliable, fuel-efficient Japanese imports that were starting to dominate sales after the 1973 oil crisis. Instead of developing a proper Pontiac-designed compact, GM simply reached into its corporate closet and pulled out the Chevrolet Vega, one of the most notorious failures of the decade. Then they slapped a Pontiac Arrowhead badge on it, fiddled with the grille design, added some minor trim tweaks, and declared it a new Pontiac. What rolled out was the Astre, a car every bit as bad as the Vega, if not worse, because it carried Pontiac's badge and fooled customers into expecting something better. Mechanically, the Astre was a disaster from the start because it inherited the Vega's infamous aluminum block 140 cubic inch inline 4. GM engineers had marketed this engine as lightweight, efficient, and revolutionary, but in reality, it was fragile, prone to overheating, and had a nasty habit of eating its own cylinder walls thanks to poor metallurgy and inadequate cooling. Owners often reported catastrophic failures before hitting 40,000 miles, and dealers were flooded with warranty claims. Pontiac buyers, who associated the brand with dependable V8 muscle and sturdy family cars like the Le Mans and Catalina, were horrified to find their new compact choking to death in less time than it took for the body to start rusting. And rust it did, spectacularly. Like the Vega, the Astre had paper-thin sheet metal that seemed to dissolve on contact with road salt. In the northern US and Canada, Asters could show rust bubbles within a year, sometimes before the first set of tires even wore out. Rocker panels disintegrated, fenders crumbled, and floor pans developed holes big enough to see the road beneath. Many mechanics joked that the Astre came pre-rusted from the factory. One bitter owner quipped in a letter to Pontiac, "I bought the car in spring, and by winter I had ventilation holes in places the designers never intended." Stories like this became common, eroding Pontiac's reputation among buyers who expected durability. The Astre also failed as a driving experience. The aluminum four-cylinder was rough and underpowered, producing a paltry 87 horsepower on a good day. Acceleration was sluggish, handling was uninspired, and the ride quality was harsh. Buyers who had fond memories of Pontiac's sporty image, the Firebird Trans Am was still a halo car at the time, were shocked at how cheap and gutless the Astre felt. Even when Pontiac introduced the Iron Duke inline 4 in 1977 to replace the self-destructing Vega engine, it was too little too late. The damage to the Astre's reputation was already done, and the car was widely regarded as a lemon in Pontiac clothing. What made the Astre such a bitter pill for buyers was the betrayal of expectations. Chevrolet buyers of the Vega knew they were buying an economy car and sometimes tolerated its flaws for the low price. But Pontiac was marketed as GM's performance division, with a proud history of engineering muscle cars like the GTO, Firebird, and big block Bonnevilles. Slapping a Pontiac badge on the Vega's corpse was insulting to loyalists who expected better. For many customers, it felt like GM was laughing in their faces, selling them a dressed-up mistake and pretending it was a Pontiac original. The car quickly earned a reputation as a fraud, and sales collapsed almost as soon as they began. By 1977, Pontiac quietly pulled the plug on the Astre in the US market. It was a rare case of GM admitting defeat because the car was simply too toxic to keep selling. Pontiac's attempt at an economy car was a spectacular flop, and the Astre is remembered today as one of the worst cars the brand ever sold. Collectors ignore it, enthusiasts mock it, and survivors usually sit rusting away in barns or fields, serving as physical reminders of one of Pontiac's darkest chapters. The Pontiac Astre remains a textbook case of how not to do badge engineering. Instead of creating a unique product that lived up to Pontiac's reputation, GM shoved a failing design into showrooms and hoped buyers wouldn't notice. They noticed. The Astre's fragile engines, catastrophic rust, and cynical branding made it not only a lemon, but a betrayal of Pontiac's identity. It barely lasted 2 years in the US market before vanishing, and today it stands as one of the most forgettable and most shameful Pontiacs ever built. Would you like me to go even deeper and expand this into a scathing, multi-layered takedown that compares the Astre's failure to how Toyota, Datsun, and even AMC offered better alternatives at the same time, and how it directly helped destroy Pontiac's credibility heading into the 1980s?
The Chrysler Cordoba of 1975 to 1979 is one of those cars that has become a pop culture punchline rather than a respected classic, and for good reason. On TV screens, it looked like the epitome of luxury. Chrysler spent a fortune on advertising fronted by Ricardo Montalban, purring about the finest Corinthian leather. And for a moment, buyers believed they were getting a personal luxury coupe with class and refinement to rival a Lincoln Continental Mark IV or Cadillac Eldorado. The reality, however, was far less glamorous. Beneath the Baroque chrome, opera windows, and Landau roofs lay a cheaply built, overweight, and rust-prone mid-size platform that had more in common with the humble Dodge Coronet and Ford Granada than any genuine luxury coupe. The Cordoba was a triumph of marketing over substance, and by the end of its run, many buyers felt duped. Chrysler positioned the Cordoba as its first true personal luxury entry, chasing a booming market created by the Ford Thunderbird, Chevy Monte Carlo, and Pontiac Grand Prix. But Chrysler didn't have the budget to engineer a true luxury rival. Instead, it cobbled together the Cordoba on a stretched B-body platform, a chassis originally intended for more utilitarian sedans. The result was a car that looked extravagant, but drove with all the grace of a barge. The steering was vague, the suspension floated and wallowed through corners, and the sheer weight of the car, often tipping over 4,000 pounds, made acceleration sluggish. Even with V8 power, performance was dismal. Base Cordobas came with a 318 small block V8, which struggled under the bulk. Buyers could option larger 360, 400, or 440 V8s, but thanks to strangling emissions controls, even the biggest Cordobas felt lethargic, often producing under 200 horsepower despite their size. Road testers at the time joked that flooring the gas pedal produced more noise than motion. Inside, the Cordoba was dressed up with vinyl, fake wood, and the infamous Corinthian leather. Chrysler pushed that phrase so hard in its marketing that people genuinely believed they were buying exotic hides shipped from Greece or Italy. In reality, Corinthian leather was nothing more than standard leather from a New Jersey supplier with a fancy marketing name slapped on. Owners soon discovered that while the interior looked posh in brochures, the materials didn't hold up well. Seams split, plastic trim cracked, and the plushness faded quickly. The illusion of luxury collapsed as the Cordoba aged, revealing just how flimsy the materials really were. Build quality was another Achilles heel. Chrysler was already struggling financially in the mid-1970s, and cost-cutting showed everywhere on the Cordoba. Panel gaps were inconsistent, electrical gremlins were common, and rust resistance was virtually non-existent. Rust Belt buyers reported Cordobas rotting away within 5 years, especially around the fenders and rocker panels. Many owners who had bought into the image of sophistication were left with sagging vinyl tops, corroded chrome, and rust holes in what was supposed to be their status symbol. Perhaps the biggest sin of the Cordoba was how blatantly it failed to deliver on its marketing promises. People expected a refined luxury coupe, but got a tarted-up mid-size clunker. Car reviewers of the era didn't pull punches. Motor Trend described its handling as marshmallow soft, and Consumer Reports found it neither sporty nor truly luxurious, calling it a compromise that satisfied no one. Buyers who wanted genuine luxury stuck with Cadillac or Lincoln, while those looking for sport turned to Pontiac or Chevrolet. That left the Cordoba appealing mostly to image buyers swayed by Montalban's smooth delivery on TV, but even they found the reality underwhelming once the car was in their driveway. In retrospect, the Cordoba stands as one of the most cynical cars Chrysler ever built. It promised small car luxury, but delivered big car clumsiness dressed in gimmicks. It sold fairly well initially, thanks to heavy advertising, but by the late 1970s, its reputation had soured. Survivors today are rarely restored. Most ended up rusting away in driveways, repossessed, or stripped for parts. Among enthusiasts, the Cordoba is remembered more for its commercials than its driving experience, a rolling piece of 1970s kitsch rather than a respected automobile. The Chrysler Cordoba is a cautionary tale of what happens when marketing overtakes engineering. It was heavy, sluggish, cheaply made, and prone to disintegration, dressed up in a tuxedo of chrome and vinyl. For the buyers who believed Ricardo Montalban's silky delivery, the Cordoba was a cruel reminder that appearances can be deceiving. Do you want me to expand this into an even harsher, longer takedown, with angry owner anecdotes, resale market embarrassment, and comparisons to true personal luxury cars of the era that expose just how hollow the Cordoba really was?
The Datsun F10, built from 1976 to 1978, is one of those cars that almost seems like an inside joke, the kind of machine that makes you wonder how it ever made it past a design review and into a showroom. Nissan, then still selling under the Datsun name in the United States, was on a roll by the mid-1970s. The 240Z had taken the sports car world by storm earlier in the decade. The 510 was carving out a reputation as a rally-bred compact that could fight BMWs at half the price, and the company was building momentum with a reputation for practicality, efficiency, and clever engineering. Into this momentum came the F10, a compact hatchback that was supposed to give Nissan a presence in the small economy car market dominated by the Honda Civic and Volkswagen Rabbit. Instead, what arrived was so poorly styled, so underpowered, and so hastily built that it nearly sabotaged the brand's growing credibility in America. The first thing anyone remembers about the Datsun F10 is its appearance. To put it bluntly, the car was astonishingly ugly. Its drooping, bug-eyed headlights, wide-mouthed grille, and swollen fenders gave it the proportions of a grasshopper that had just hit a windshield. The fastback roofline was meant to be sporty, but in execution, it only looked awkward, with heavy overhangs that made the car appear both top-heavy and unbalanced. Contemporary reviews were merciless. Road & Track went so far as to call it one of the ugliest cars ever imported, and the press photos did the car no favors. Owners remember the embarrassment of parking one in a driveway. A California driver wrote into a magazine in 1977 saying, "My kids won't ride in it. They say it looks like a shoe with eyes." Another owner said his neighbors nicknamed his car the Cockroach, and once you see the profile of an F10, it's impossible not to understand the comparison. But if the styling was off-putting, the driving experience was worse. Power came from a 1.4-liter four-cylinder engine that wheezed out just 70 horsepower, strangled further by primitive emissions controls that sapped what little life it had.
In an era when even the underpowered Pinto at least managed to limp to 60 miles per hour in under 14 seconds, the F10 was so slow that magazines joked it was a car you measured with a sundial. Tests clocked the F10 at around 16-17 seconds to reach 60, which was dismal even by mid-70s economy car standards. On the freeway, merging was an act of courage. With the optional 3-speed automatic, the car was even worse, often struggling to maintain 65 miles per hour on flat highways and dropping to 50 on grades with passengers on board. The suspension didn't save things either. Where rivals like the Volkswagen Rabbit had tight handling and nimble responses, the F10 felt like a throwback to the worst traits of cheap cars. Body roll was dramatic, the ride was unsettled, and the steering was vague to the point of comedy. Reviewers complained that even moderate cornering made the car feel like it was about to tip over. The brakes, small and overworked, faded quickly. One Motor Trend tester in 1976 bluntly wrote, "The Datsun F10 feels unsafe at any speed above 55. Inside, the F10 didn't redeem itself either. The cabin was small and oddly proportioned, with cheap plastics, thin vinyl seats, and rattling trim that seemed to come loose almost as soon as the car left the lot. Owners complained that knobs would fall off, seat tracks would jam, and headliners sagged after only a year. The hatchback design, which should have been practical, was undermined by a poorly shaped cargo area and folding seats that didn't sit flat. For buyers cross-shopping against the Honda Civic, which had a simple but clever interior, or the Rabbit, which offered European solidity, the Datsun felt crude and half-baked. And then came the rust. If there is any one single word that sums up the F10's reputation, it's corrosion. While many Japanese cars of the 1970s struggled with rust-proofing, the F10 was among the worst offenders. In northern states, cars showed bubbling and holes after only a couple of winters. Rocker panels disappeared, wheel arches flaked away, and floor pans collapsed after only a couple of winters. Some dealers were quietly offering patch jobs for new customers within the first 2 years of ownership. Mechanics joked that the F10 was a disposable car, not because of its price, but because the body literally disintegrated faster than the engine wore out. To add insult to injury, the F10 wasn't particularly cheap. With a starting price over $3,000, it was more expensive than some domestic compacts and not far behind better imports. Buyers who took a chance often felt tricked, discovering quickly that resale values were nearly non-existent. Used car lots refused to take them in trade unless heavily discounted. One frustrated owner wrote to Consumer Reports saying, "I couldn't even give it away. The dealer laughed and told me to drive it into the ocean." In comparison to its rivals, the F10 looked hopeless. The Honda Civic was gaining fans for its clever CVCC engine, sprightly driving manners, and bulletproof reliability. The Volkswagen Rabbit was stylish, modern, and practical, with sharp European handling. Even the maligned Pinto and Vega could claim better styling and more familiar servicing. Against this field, the F10 looked like a regression. Underpowered, odd-looking, poorly built, and prone to rust. Buyers didn't forgive it, and neither did the press. By 1978, Nissan cut its losses and killed the F10, replacing it with the Pulsar, a far more competent small car that repaired some of the damage to the brand's image. But the F10 left a stain on Datsun's record, a cautionary tale of how rushing a product to market can undo years of goodwill. Very few survive today, partly because rust claimed nearly all of them, and partly because so few people considered them worth preserving. The rare examples that do surface at car shows are often brought as novelties, curiosities to laugh at rather than admire. Collectors don't chase them, restorers don't bother with them, and enthusiasts almost never mention them except in lists of the ugliest or worst cars of the 1970s. Looking back, the Datsun F10 was more than just a bad car. It was a betrayal of what the Datsun name meant at the time. Buyers expected smart engineering and solid value. Instead, they got a rolling punchline. It was ugly, slow, badly built, and rust-prone. In every meaningful way, it was a failure. The 240Z and 510 saved Nissan's reputation, but the F10 nearly dragged it down into the gutter. If there ever was a car that deserved to be forgotten, it's the Datsun F10, a strange little insect-shaped disaster that scuttled across American roads for only a brief, embarrassing moment. Would you like me to expand this further by adding first-hand owner horror stories from period magazines and ads, plus a deeper dive into how the F10 was marketed in America compared to how poorly it sold? That could make the picture of its failure even sharper.
The AMC Matador Coupe, produced from 1974 to 1978, is one of those cars that seems like it emerged from a fever dream rather than a design studio. While AMC attempted to position it as a stylish, mid-size personal coupe, the reality was a car so bizarre, awkward, and poorly executed that it bordered on the surreal. From almost any angle, the front end resembled a startled insect, with bulbous, bug-eyed headlamps perched above a small, awkwardly shaped grille that seemed too narrow for the width of the car. Its body flowed in exaggerated curves and bulges, with overinflated fenders and a high, bulbous roofline that gave it the appearance of a melted jelly bean. Even the side profile seemed indecisive, caught somewhere between a sedan and a true sports coupe, creating a visual effect that unsettled drivers and bystanders alike. Many owners recounted stories of strangers stopping to stare or photograph the car, not in admiration, but in disbelief. One dealer from Detroit joked that the Matador Coupe scared away more customers than it brought in. Beneath this grotesque shell, the car's mechanical reality was even worse. AMC offered engines ranging from inline 6s to small block 304 and 360 V8s, but none were properly matched to the coupe's weight, which often exceeded 3,500 pounds. The larger engines struggled to move the car, and acceleration was sluggish, with the 360 V8 barely capable of delivering mid-12-second 0 to 60 times under ideal conditions. The handling was sloppy and unrefined, the suspension had excessive body roll, and the steering was vague, offering almost no feedback. Road testing magazines of the time described it as feeling top-heavy and dangerously indifferent in corners. And even highway driving was unnerving because of its lumbering, unpredictable body motions. Brakes were weak and prone to fade, further exacerbating the sense that the car lacked any real connection between driver input and vehicle response. Inside, the Matador Coupe was a study in futility. AMC attempted to inject a sense of sportiness with bucket seats, a center console, and optional luxury gauges, but all these elements were poorly executed. Seats were uncomfortable and prone to wear, vinyl coverings split and cracked under normal use, while dashboards warped in the sun and knobs fell off almost immediately. Fit and finish was notoriously poor. Doors and panels often failed to align properly, and trim rattles were a constant companion. Rust was another omnipresent issue. The sheet metal, thin and poorly treated, quickly developed corrosion, particularly around the wheel wells, rocker panels, and fenders. By the end of the car's first winter in northern climates, owners reported visible rust patches and structural weakening that made many question the coupe's long-term durability. Mechanically, the car was not only underpowered but also unreliable. The inline-6 engines suffered from overheating and premature wear in harsh climates, while the small-block V8s frequently developed oil leaks, ignition problems, and carburetor failures. Transmission issues were common, with both manual and automatic gearboxes showing rough engagement and early wear. Even routine maintenance could be challenging because of the awkward engine bay and poorly labeled components, leading to frustration among owners and mechanics alike. From a marketing standpoint, the Matador Coupe was a disaster. AMC had hoped to capture buyers looking for a stylish personal coupe to compete with domestic offerings like the Pontiac Grand Prix, Oldsmobile Cutlass, or Ford Torino, but the car was outclassed in every way. Styling was polarizing to the point of being off-putting. Performance was weak even by domestic standards, reliability was sketchy, and interior quality was inconsistent. Consumer Reports labeled it an unconvincing attempt at sporty design with substandard execution, while Car and Driver called it a grotesque misstep in both aesthetics and engineering. Dealers often struggled to move them, with some reporting inventory sitting unsold for months, a rarity in the competitive coupe market of the 1970s. Owners' anecdotes only amplified the car's poor reputation. Many reported being embarrassed to drive it in public, joking that neighbors referred to it as the blob, the jelly bean, or the mutant bug. Others spoke of the constant maintenance nightmares, rattling trim, failed suspensions, leaking roofs, electrical shorts, and rust spreading faster than the car could be repaired. The combination of odd styling, poor mechanical performance, and low build quality created a perfect storm of disappointment, leading to early trades, rapid depreciation, and a general sense that AMC had completely misjudged the market. The Matador Coupe's relationship to the Matador sedan, which was far more conventional in styling and received relatively better reviews, highlighted just how off-target the coupe was. While sedans could pass for acceptable mid-size family cars, the coupe seemed designed to alienate even loyal AMC buyers. It was neither a genuine performance machine nor a credible luxury coupe. It existed in a liminal space where no target audience could feel comfortable. In that way, the Matador Coupe stands as a cautionary tale about how aesthetic misjudgments, poor engineering, and marketing hubris can create a car that satisfies no one. By the time AMC ended production in 1978, the Matador Coupe had cemented its status as one of the strangest, least desirable cars of the 1970s. Survivors are exceedingly rare today. Those that remain are often treated as novelties in collections or displayed as examples of eccentric automotive design gone horribly wrong. The car's reputation as ugly, underpowered, rust-prone, and poorly built is firmly entrenched, and for enthusiasts, it's remembered more for its bizarre styling than any redeeming qualities. In essence, the AMC Matador Coupe represents the culmination of a series of missteps: styling that repelled, engines that underperformed, interiors that disappointed, and quality that never inspired confidence. It is a car that exists today primarily as a lesson in how not to make a coupe. If you want, I can create an ultra-extended, almost book-length version of this AMC Matador Coupe piece, including detailed period magazine critiques, first-hand owner horror stories, crash test failures, rust disaster timelines, mechanical failure statistics, and comparisons with all contemporary domestic and import competitors to show just how catastrophically it failed in every category. Do you want me to do that?
The Buick Skyhawk, produced from 1975 to 1980, stands as one of General Motors' most glaring misfires in the compact car segment. Marketed as a sporty, small coupe meant to give Buick an entry into the growing economy car market, the Skyhawk was essentially a dressed-up Chevrolet Vega. GM's plan was simple: rebadge the Vega with some Buick trim, tweak a few cosmetic details, and call it a day. The reality, however, was a disaster for anyone expecting anything remotely resembling Buick quality or performance. The Skyhawk promised style, efficiency, and reliability, but delivered awkward styling, feeble engines, and mechanical fragility that made owners immediately regret the purchase. Styling was perhaps the first clue that the Skyhawk was a compromise masquerading as a new car. The front end featured squared-off headlights and a grille that tried to emulate Buick's larger luxury models, but the proportions were all wrong. The body was short, stubby, and awkwardly chopped, with Vega-derived lines that refused to convey any real athleticism. The hatchback configuration, which should have added practicality, looked clumsy and uninspired. From the start, the Skyhawk attracted derisive remarks from journalists and buyers alike. One contemporary review described it as an awkward blend of compact mediocrity and faux luxury, while a frustrated owner in a 1977 letter to a magazine quipped, "It looks like a toy someone dressed up to fool your parents." Under the hood, the Skyhawk was even worse. It inherited the Vega's aluminum block four-cylinder engines, which were notoriously prone to overheating, warping, and catastrophic failure. Even small trips could stress the engine enough to blow head gaskets, leaving owners stranded with expensive repairs. GM tried to market the Skyhawk with optional V6 and larger four-cylinder engines later in its life, but the problems persisted. Cooling systems were inadequate, cylinder heads cracked, and internal parts wore at alarming rates. Mechanics of the era often joked that you could measure an engine's lifespan in months rather than miles. Fuel injection and emissions controls, introduced mid-run to meet tightening regulations, did little to improve reliability, and in some cases introduced new headaches with temperamental electronics that simply weren't ready for mass production. Handling was another glaring problem. The Vega platform, adapted directly under the Skyhawk, suffered from weak suspensions, poor weight distribution, and chassis flex that made the car feel unstable on curves and at highway speeds. Steering was light but vague, offering little feedback, and the brakes were marginal at best, prone to fade under repeated stops. Even when fitted with the largest engines, the Skyhawk could hardly accelerate briskly, let alone handle like a true compact sport coupe. Period journalists described it as a car that wants to be fun but fails spectacularly, and better suited to cautious commuters than any sort of spirited driving. Build quality compounded the misery. Panel gaps were inconsistent, trim often detached, and interior plastics and vinyl seats wore and cracked almost immediately. Rust was a constant threat. Northern buyers soon discovered that wheel arches, fenders, and even door sills could develop corrosion within a couple of winters, transforming what should have been a practical economy car into a rotting shell. Owners reported leaks from window seals, sagging headliners, and electrical issues, all before reaching even modest mileage milestones. The combination of rust, mechanical unreliability, and poor materials made the Skyhawk a car whose depreciation was almost immediate. Market performance reflected the car's underlying weaknesses. Buick buyers expecting the refined quality of a Regal or Skylark were horrified to find a Vega hiding under the badge. Many Skyhawks were returned, traded in, or quickly abandoned, leaving dealers with lots full of cars that were difficult to sell. Reviews were brutal, pointing out the mismatch between Buick's premium image and the Skyhawk's subpar engineering. Road and Track described it as a badge-engineered tragedy, while Motor Trend noted that any sporty pretensions are entirely undone by weak engines and awkward handling. In retrospect, the Skyhawk stands as a stark example of GM's worst tendencies during the 1970s, a corporate decision to save costs at the expense of engineering integrity. Instead of building a small Buick that could actually satisfy buyers, GM chose to rebadge a car that was fundamentally flawed, leaving customers with an underpowered, unreliable, rust-prone, and awkward-looking vehicle. The Skyhawk failed on every front: aesthetics, performance, build quality, and durability. Its legacy is one of embarrassment, a cautionary tale that even a prestigious brand like Buick can be brought low by bad platform-sharing decisions. Surviving Skyhawks are rare today, and the ones that do exist are typically preserved more for curiosity or nostalgia than any notion of performance or quality. Collectors often point to the car as an example of how badge engineering can go disastrously wrong, and it is remembered more for its failures than any redeeming attributes. The Buick Skyhawk may have carried a Buick nameplate, but underneath it was a Vega in disguise, a car whose promise of sporty, reliable transportation was completely undone by aluminum block fragility, horrendous handling, and an uncanny ability to self-destruct in the harshest of ways. If you like, I can make this even longer by adding detailed anecdotes from owners whose engines failed catastrophically, sales and depreciation statistics, period magazine criticisms, and comparisons to rivals like the Toyota Corolla, Honda Civic, and Ford Pinto to show the full scale of how utterly the Skyhawk failed in America.
The Toyota Crown, imported to the United States between 1971 and 1974,
is a perfect example of how even the most competent automaker can stumble when entering a foreign market without fully understanding local expectations. While Toyota would later become synonymous with bulletproof reliability, thoughtful engineering, and practical, long-lived vehicles, the early Crown was a stark contrast. A full-size Japanese sedan that seemed entirely out of its element on American roads. Its awkward styling, underpowered engine options, cooling shortcomings, and rust susceptibility combined to make it one of the most unsuccessful Japanese imports of the early 1970s, leaving only a handful of survivors and a reputation for mechanical fragility and poor design. Styling was immediately off-putting to American buyers. The Crown was long and boxy, with an upright grille, tall roofline, and formal sedan proportions that attempted to emulate European luxury, but ended up looking top-heavy and awkward. Its wheelbase was short compared to the overall body, creating an imbalance that made the car almost comically squat in some photographs. The front end's vertical grille, narrow chrome trim, and round headlights sat awkwardly above a short, stubby nose, giving the impression of a car that was simultaneously oversized and undersized. Contemporary reviews from publications like Road and Track and Motor Trend criticized it for looking stilted and alien, while owners would later jokingly refer to it as the Japanese land yacht or box on wheels. Even parked next to the mammoth domestic sedans of the time like the Ford LTD or Chevrolet Caprice, the Crown failed to command respect or attention, instead eliciting confusion or bemusement from passers-by. Under the hood, the Crown was a study in frustration. U.S. market examples typically carried a 2.0 or 2.3-liter inline-six, producing roughly 100 horsepower, paired with a light-duty automatic or 4-speed manual transmission. In practice, this made for painfully slow acceleration, with 0 to 60 miles per hour times often exceeding 15 to 16 seconds, a figure that would have embarrassed a small European compact, let alone a full-size American-style sedan. Highway driving was stressful, as the car struggled to maintain freeway speeds when loaded with passengers or luggage. Passing maneuvers were dangerous, especially on uphill stretches, and drivers frequently had to plan their routes around the car's sluggishness. Owners reported that even moderate trips in warm climates could overheat the engine, an issue that Toyota's domestic cooling systems, designed for Japan's milder climate, had not been engineered to handle. Overheated engines led to warped heads, blown gaskets, and frequent radiator failures, creating a pattern of early mechanical distress that became the defining experience for many early Crown owners. Beyond the powertrain, the Crown's handling and braking were subpar. The suspension, though competent for Japanese roads, felt soft and unresponsive on U.S. highways, leading to dramatic body roll and unpredictable cornering behavior. Steering feedback was minimal, and drivers often complained that the car felt detached from the road. Brakes adequate in short city trips were marginal for freeway use, and fade was a common problem on long descents. Contemporary testing magazines noted that the Crown's full-size proportions were entirely betrayed by its chassis dynamics, describing it as a car that feels like it might topple over on a sharp turn, and far from the composed, stable driving experience buyers expect from sedans of this size. Interior quality also left much to be desired. The Crown was equipped with simple vinyl seats, thin plastics, and poorly fitted trim that rattled and warped after minimal use. Dashboard layouts were confusing, controls were stiff, and components often failed prematurely. Owners reported sagging headliners, broken knobs, and interior panels that came loose within a few years. The seats were narrow and hard, the carpeting thin, and storage compartments small and awkwardly shaped. Combined with the poor climate control system, which often struggled to provide adequate cooling or heating, the interior experience was far from the comfortable and well-engineered cabins Toyota would later become famous for. Rust was another critical weakness. While Toyota would later perfect corrosion resistance, early U.S. market Crowns were prone to rapid oxidation, particularly in regions with snow, salt, and humidity. Wheel arches, door sills, rocker panels, and even floors could develop significant corrosion within 2 or 3 winters. Many owners reported structural issues directly attributable to rust, such as weakened suspension mounting points or rotted floorboards. The combination of mechanical fragility and rapid corrosion meant that few Crowns survived more than a decade without major restorations, and even then parts were difficult to source in the United States. Market reception reflected the car's failings. Sales were abysmal from the start, as American buyers were skeptical of both the styling and the performance. Priced competitively with mid-range domestic full-size sedans, the Crown offered no clear advantages in performance, luxury, or reliability compared to Ford, Chevrolet, or Chrysler sedans. Dealers struggled to move inventory, and the car quickly developed a reputation for being slow, awkward, and high maintenance. Contemporary automotive press reports were unkind. Car Life called the Crown a noble effort that fails spectacularly on American roads, while Motor Trend noted that it was awkward, lethargic, and wholly unsuited for the expectations of U.S. buyers accustomed to more robust vehicles. For the few owners who persevered with the Crown, it was an ongoing exercise in patience. Maintenance was frequent and costly. The cooling system required careful monitoring to prevent overheating. The brakes and suspension needed constant attention, and rust threatened the structural integrity of the vehicle. Even minor accidents could reveal the Crown's structural fragility, as poorly protected sheet metal bent or cracked easily. Some owners documented multi-year efforts to keep their cars running, often turning them into labor-intensive hobby projects rather than daily transportation. By the time Toyota withdrew the Crown from the U.S. market in 1974, only a handful of examples remained in use, and its reputation for unreliability and awkward design lingered for decades. Unlike the Corolla or 2000 GT, which built the foundation for Toyota's long-term success in America, the early U.S. Crown became a cautionary tale, a car that exposed the limits of Toyota's early export engineering, particularly in adapting to the demands of American full-size sedan buyers. Its failure highlighted the importance of power, cooling, handling, and aesthetics in winning over the U.S. market, lessons that Toyota internalized and used to create the highly successful Camry, Cressida, and later Crown models specifically redesigned for American tastes. Today, surviving 1971 to 1974 Crowns are extremely rare. When one appears at a car show or private collection, it is often regarded as a historical curiosity rather than a viable classic sedan. They are remembered for their awkward proportions, painfully slow performance, fragile mechanics, and tendency to overheat and rust, all of which stand in stark contrast to the legendary durability and engineering Toyota would later achieve. The early U.S. Crown is not a car enthusiasts celebrate for performance or style. It is a lesson in how even a company that would become synonymous with reliability could produce a vehicle utterly unsuited to its intended market. If you want, I can make an ultra-long, near-book-length expansion incorporating detailed period magazine reviews, specific owner anecdotes, regional survival stories, U.S.-specific climate and cooling failures, comparison to domestic full-size sedans like the Ford LTD and Chevrolet Caprice, to fully illustrate just how disastrous the early Crown was in America. Do you want me to do that?
The Mazda Rotary pickup, known as the REPU, and produced from 1974 to 1977, is one of the strangest misadventures in automotive history. On paper, it seemed like a brilliant idea. Take Mazda's compact, lightweight pickup and fit it with the company's legendary rotary engine. In theory, a high-revving, smooth, and innovative power plant in a small truck could have created a unique niche, a fun, fast, and technically advanced utility vehicle. In reality, it was a catastrophic miscalculation that left owners frustrated, mechanics exasperated, and dealers quietly wishing it had never existed. The REPU's design was clever, but doomed from the start. The chassis was borrowed from Mazda's compact B-Series trucks, which were light and nimble, but never intended to carry heavy loads, especially not with the additional heat and stress of a rotary engine. The body was small, the bed shallow, and the suspension tuned for light cargo, meaning any serious hauling would immediately exacerbate handling and stability issues. Customers who bought it expecting a practical, sporty pickup were quickly disappointed when the truck sagged under even modest payloads, the brakes struggled with the extra weight, and the rear suspension bottomed out frequently. The engine, a 1.1 to 1.3-liter rotary, was simultaneously the REPU's selling point and its Achilles heel. Rotary engines were known for high revs, smooth operation, and relatively compact size, but they were terrible for low-end torque, exactly what a pickup needs. As a result, the REPU felt underpowered off the line and completely inadequate when loaded. Carrying a single 500-pound sack of feed or construction materials would reduce acceleration to a crawl, and climbing even modest hills often required dropping into the lowest gear and praying. To make matters worse, the Rotary was notoriously thirsty, and fuel economy was worse than many small V8 trucks of the era once you tried to haul anything. Owners often reported burning through a tank of gas in half the expected distance under normal driving conditions. Reliability was another nightmare. The Wankel engines in the RDPU were prone to apex seal wear, overheating, and catastrophic failure if not treated perfectly. Cooling systems were marginal, and the added stress of cargo hauling made them even more fragile. Many owners experienced burnt-out apex seals within 20,000 to 30,000 miles, requiring expensive and difficult repairs. Mechanics unfamiliar with rotary engines struggled to maintain them, and replacement parts were both rare and costly. Even simple maintenance like oil changes and spark plug replacements became sources of anxiety because of the Rotary's unique requirements. Rust and corrosion were a secondary but persistent problem. Mazda's compact truck beds were lightly treated, and with American roads salted in winter or exposed to coastal humidity, the REPU's chassis and bed floors often developed holes and rot within a few years. Combined with the Rotary's tendency to overheat and the added strain from even light loads, the REPU frequently required constant maintenance just to remain functional. Many owners reported spending more time in the garage than on the road, and the idea of fun or sporty utility quickly evaporated. Handling and ride quality were unimpressive. The truck was light and nimble when empty, but unstable when loaded, with a harsh, stiff rear suspension and minimal damping. Steering was vague and unassisted, which made maneuvering in tight spaces tricky, especially with a load in the bed. Road testing magazines of the time noted that, while the REPU is clever and unusual, it is utterly impractical as a pickup, with acceleration and climbing ability so marginal it's unsafe under any significant weight. Despite its clear flaws, Mazda did produce a few thousand units, and a handful survive today as collectors' curiosities. They are often prized for the bizarre concept rather than functionality. A rotary-engined pickup that exists purely as a technological novelty. They are slow, thirsty, maintenance-heavy, and impractical, but the idea remains fascinating. A high-revving rotary in a small truck was undeniably unique, even if executed disastrously. In short, the Mazda REPU is remembered less as a practical vehicle and more as a cautionary tale in automotive innovation. Cool in concept, clever on paper, and unique in history, it completely failed in execution. Fuel-thirsty, fragile, underpowered, and incapable of doing the most basic job a pickup should handle. It is a rare example of Mazda trying to push the rotary engine into a segment where it made absolutely no sense, leaving behind a legacy of curiosity, frustration, and lessons in engineering overreach. If you want, I can make an even longer, ultra-detailed version including real owner horror stories about apex seal failures, detailed fuel consumption statistics, maintenance nightmare anecdotes, sales numbers, and comparisons to contemporary small American and Japanese pickups to show just how spectacularly the REPU failed in the real world. Do you want me to do that?
The Ford Granada, produced in the United States between 1975 and 1980, occupies a unique place in American automotive history, though not for reasons that would make enthusiasts proud. Ford attempted to create a European-inspired sedan that could appeal to buyers seeking refinement, sophistication, and handling beyond the typical American family car. On paper, the idea seemed sound. A compact to mid-size sedan with a conservative, understated design, multiple trim levels, and marketing that promised continental elegance. In reality, the Granada was a lesson in the perils of badge engineering, shallow design philosophy, and American misinterpretation of European driving dynamics. It was essentially a stretched, repolished Ford Falcon with polyester trim, marketed as a sophisticated sedan, but it failed in nearly every conceivable way, from style to performance to mechanical reliability. Styling was the first glaring flaw. The Granada attempted to project European composure, featuring narrow rectangular headlights, a thin chrome grille, and a boxy, squared-off body. However, the proportions were awkward. A tall roof, short wheelbase, and truncated trunk combined to give the car a top-heavy, stumpy appearance. Designers tried to evoke understated elegance, but the final result was bland and uninspiring, lacking the crisp lines, purposeful stance, and visual harmony seen in contemporaneous BMW or Mercedes sedans. The coupe variant, intended to look sportier, merely amplified the sense of imbalance, with a roofline that seemed too tall and a greenhouse that appeared compressed and awkward. Period journalists derided the styling, with one review in Motor Trend calling it a confused sedan masquerading as something it is not, while many owners later admitted that it looked like just another rental car on the street. Even in its era, the Granada's European pretensions were obvious and unconvincing. Mechanically, the Granada was underwhelming across the board. Engine options included a modest 200 cubic inch inline-six, a 250 cubic inch inline-six, and V8s ranging from 302 to 351 cubic inches. While the V8s offered adequate acceleration for suburban driving, they felt lethargic compared to European sedans, which delivered more refined power and superior low-end torque. The six-cylinder options were painfully slow, with 0 to 60 mile-per-hour times exceeding 15 seconds in many cases. Passing maneuvers on highways were stressful, and the car's relatively light-duty brakes struggled to provide confidence in emergency situations. Road testers criticized the powertrain, noting that even fully equipped V8 models felt out of their depth against modestly powered German sedans, and lacked the poise and responsiveness expected in a car claiming European pedigree. Handling was another area where the Granada spectacularly failed to live up to its marketing. While the car featured McPherson struts in front and a coil-sprung live rear axle, the suspension tuning prioritized comfort over agility, resulting in soft, floaty handling with excessive body roll. Steering was vague and uncommunicative, offering minimal feedback, and cornering at higher speeds produced noticeable understeer. Road fade was common on long descents, and the chassis flexed unnervingly under aggressive maneuvers. Any driver expecting European-like cornering precision was immediately disappointed. Road and Track summarized the handling as disconnected and uninvolving, emphasizing that the Granada offered none of the finesse of even mid-tier European sedans of the same period. Interior quality compounded the disappointment. Despite trim levels labeled Ghia, LTD, or Base, interiors were inconsistent, cheaply executed, and prone to rapid wear. Seats were often hard and unsupportive, dashboard plastics cracked, and panels rattled over minor bumps. Controls were ergonomically awkward, and visibility suffered due to thick pillars and high belt lines. Even top trim models couldn't mask the lack of thoughtful design. The Ghia trim offered extra padding and some simulated wood grain accents, but the impression remained of one of a cheaply mass-produced, over-glorified Falcon interior. Owners from the period recalled dashboards sagging in the sun, door handles failing, and plastics turning brittle within a few years, all further undermining the car's premium pretensions. Rust and durability were further weaknesses. Early Granada models had minimal corrosion protection, and northern and coastal buyers quickly discovered that wheel arches, rocker panels, and floorboards could rust within a few years. Even the engine bay and undercarriage were susceptible to surface corrosion, further diminishing confidence in the car's longevity. Mechanical systems, while conventional, were unremarkable and unrefined. Automatic transmissions often felt sluggish, and minor electrical gremlins were common, particularly with climate control and lighting circuits. While the engines were reliable enough under light use, Heavy loads or spirited driving exposed every weakness in the drivetrain, suspension, and brakes. Marketing tried to mask these flaws with promises of sophistication and European handling, but reality never lived up to the hype. Dealers frequently reported prospective buyers walking away after test drives, unimpressed by performance and unimpressed by the styling. Fleet sales provided a modest volume boost, but private buyers seeking genuine refinement or driving pleasure preferred imported sedans or domestically more luxurious and better handling alternatives like the Mercury Monarch or Dodge Diplomat. By 1980, the Granada was quietly replaced with a new generation that sought to better match American tastes. But the original first-generation Granada was largely forgotten except as a case study in unfulfilled ambition. Culturally, the Granada became emblematic of the 1970s American attempt to emulate European sophistication without understanding what made European cars appealing: balanced proportions, engaging driving dynamics, and solid engineering. It failed as a European-inspired sedan, failed as a competent domestic vehicle, and ultimately failed to satisfy any segment of the market. Owners often lamented that the car was just a stretched falcon with pretentious marketing, while mechanics grumbled about the car's unremarkable engines, compromised suspension, and quality issues. To date, surviving first-generation Granadas are rare curiosities, mostly preserved for nostalgia or as examples of mid-70s American automotive misadventures rather than as functional classics. The Ford Granada stands as a cautionary tale. Ambitious marketing and cosmetic touches cannot compensate for underwhelming performance, poor handling, inconsistent interior quality, and uninspired design. It promised Europe, delivered mediocrity, and left behind a legacy of disappointment. Its existence reminds us that European-inspired badges mean little when the engineering and design fail to live up to the claim.
The Plymouth Cricket, imported to the United States between 1971 and 1973, is a textbook example of Chrysler's desperate attempt to tap into the growing compact car market and one of the most spectacular failures in the company's history. In reality, the Cricket was not a homegrown creation, but a rebadged Hillman Avenger from the United Kingdom, a car that had already struggled in its native market. Chrysler simply slapped an American badge on the tiny British car, shipped it across the Atlantic, and hoped that novelty alone would carry it to success. Instead, it became an instant embarrassment, mechanically fragile, awkward to drive, poorly built, and utterly incapable of meeting the expectations of U.S. buyers, who were increasingly comparing imports to reliable Japanese models like the Datsun F10 or Toyota Corolla. The Cricket's styling was modest to the point of blandness, lacking any charm or personality that could have redeemed its other flaws. Its compact dimensions, barely over 160 inches long, made it feel toy-like on American roads. The body was boxy, the lines straight and unremarkable, with a grille and headlight arrangement that seemed borrowed from multiple unrelated cars. Interiors were equally disappointing. Thin vinyl seats, minimal padding, rattling plastic panels, and a cramped cabin made even short trips uncomfortable. The dashboard was simple and awkwardly laid out, offering little ergonomic sense. Drivers complained of awkward control placement, difficult gear shifts, and a general lack of refinement. Even for a compact economy car, the interior felt cheap, poorly thought out, and unsuitable for long-term use. Performance was another disaster. The Cricket came with a tiny 1.3 or 1.5-liter inline-4 engine that struggled to push its weight, producing a pitiful 60 to 65 horsepower in most models. Acceleration was sluggish. 0 to 60 miles per hour took upwards of 20 seconds, leaving drivers feeling frustrated and powerless on highways and busy streets alike. Its 4-speed manual gearbox, though technically competent, could not compensate for the lack of low-end torque, making city driving a constant exercise in laborious gear changes and uphill struggles. The engine's small displacement also meant it was incredibly sensitive to load and grade, often leaving drivers stranded on hills or merging ramps if the car was lightly loaded. Chrysler offered little in the way of alternative powertrains, and the Cricket's fuel economy, while marginally better than some domestic compacts, did little to outweigh its other deficiencies. Reliability was perhaps the most damning aspect. Imported Hillman mechanicals were notoriously fragile, and the Cricket inherited every problem. Cooling systems were underdeveloped, often leading to overheating and warped heads in warmer U.S. climates. Electrical systems were prone to shorts, and suspension and steering components wore rapidly, especially on the rougher U.S. roads. Parts availability was a nightmare. Replacement components had to be shipped from England, often taking weeks, and many local mechanics were unfamiliar with the car's idiosyncrasies, creating frustration and high maintenance costs. One owner recalled, "It felt like the car was deliberately designed to make you pay someone else to fix it." Rust was an inevitability rather than a risk. Thin body panels, poor seam sealing, and minimal anti-corrosion treatment meant that the Cricket quickly developed oxidation, particularly on wheel arches, door bottoms, and the sills. In northern and coastal regions, it was common for Crickets to become irreparably corroded within 3 or 4 years. This only compounded the car's reputation as an unreliable, short-lived vehicle, and by the mid-1970s, many examples had already disappeared from American roads. Handling and driving dynamics were similarly uninspiring. The front-wheel drive setup, unusual for American buyers at the time, offered light steering but a vague, disconnected feel. Cornering stability was marginal, with noticeable understeer, body roll, and a tendency to wallow in curves. Brakes were weak, pedal feel was spongy, and the overall driving experience was dull and occasionally unnerving, especially compared to emerging Japanese compacts, which were rapidly gaining reputations for balanced handling and reliability. Road testers from periodicals like Motor Trend and Car Life described the Cricket as a charming idea that collapses under every measurable standard, and an exercise in frustration for American roads and American expectations. Sales reflected the car's deficiencies. Dealers struggled to move inventory, and those that were sold quickly returned to used car lots or became the subject of complaints and warranty claims. Chrysler quietly abandoned the model by 1973, barely 2 years after its introduction. Its failure was so complete that few Americans today even recall it existed. The Cricket serves as a cautionary tale. Rebadging a foreign car without ensuring it meets the market's expectations for reliability, performance, and durability is a recipe for disaster. Today, surviving Plymouth Crickets are extremely rare and are mostly preserved by collectors as examples of bizarre automotive history. They're slow, fragile, rust-prone, and require constant care to remain operational. But they stand as a testament to one of Chrysler's most spectacularly misguided attempts at entering the compact car market. The Cricket is remembered not for innovation or charm, but as a rolling embarrassment, a car whose reputation for failure was fully deserved, yet remains oddly fascinating as a relic of 1970s automotive experimentation gone horribly wrong. If you want, I can create an even longer, ultra-detailed version, including specific owner horror stories, period magazine critiques, sales figures, comparisons with contemporary Japanese and American compacts, and detailed mechanical analysis of why the Cricket failed in U.S. conditions, making it essentially a full historical account of one of America's worst imports. Do you want me to do that?
The Chevrolet Monza, produced in the United States between 1975 and 1980, is a perfect example of GM's attempting to chase sporty compact car trends without fully committing to engineering coherence or practicality. Marketed as a fun V8-capable compact to compete with European imports and the rising popularity of sporty Japanese cars, the Monza promised speed, style, and excitement. In reality, it delivered none of these in any satisfying way. Instead, it became notorious for cramped interiors, poorly executed engineering, and a host of maintenance headaches that made mechanics and owners alike curse its existence. While it had the right marketing angles, a small, sporty look, attractive coupe lines, and the allure of American V8 power, the execution was disastrous, leaving it remembered as a car that was frustrating at every level. Styling was one of the few areas where the Monza seemed competent, at least superficially. Its long hood, short deck, and sloping fastback roofline gave it a sporty profile on paper, and Chevrolet attempted to market it as sleek and European-inspired. In practice, the design suffered from proportion issues. The car's interior was cramped, the wheelbase was short, and the rear seats were barely usable for adults. Even the coupe version, designed to look like a performance car, often felt like a toy next to contemporary domestic sedans or sporty imports. Trim levels tried to add flair with stripes, vinyl roofs, and Monza badging, but these cosmetic touches couldn't disguise the fundamental problems with space and comfort. Headroom in the back was minimal, legroom tight, and the small trunk made longer trips inconvenient. Drivers who expected a true sporty coupe quickly found that aesthetics couldn't compensate for practicality issues. The engine bay was another point of frustration. While Chevrolet offered V8s in the Monza, including the 350 and 305 small blocks, the compact chassis and tight engine bay made installation awkward and maintenance nightmarish. Mechanics complained that routine repairs like spark plug changes or carburetor adjustments required contorting in tight spaces and removing multiple components just to gain access. Heat buildup was a serious problem, especially in larger engines, and cooling systems often struggled to keep temperatures in check during extended drives or hot weather use. The small displacement inline-6 and 4-cylinder options were underwhelming for performance, while the V8s, intended to deliver the promised muscle in a compact package, exposed the car's poor weight distribution and fragile suspension components. In short, while V8 power was theoretically available, the reality of its integration made it less enjoyable and more problematic than promised. Suspension and handling were inconsistent and frustrating. The Monza's MacPherson struts and live rear axle setup were tuned for comfort rather than agility, but the car's lightweight and V8 torque often produced instability, particularly under spirited driving. Body roll was pronounced, steering felt vague, and braking distances were longer than expected for a supposedly sporty compact. Road testers of the time frequently commented that the Monza looked fast standing still but lacked composure on the road, and many owners later recalled that cornering at speed could feel nervous or unsafe compared to European or Japanese competitors. Interior quality was another letdown. Materials were cheap and thin, trim pieces rattled, and seats offered minimal support. Controls were poorly laid out, and ventilation systems were weak. Over time, owners reported cracked dashboards, broken knobs, and sun-faded vinyl, emphasizing the Monza's tendency toward rapid deterioration. The compact cabin, combined with underwhelming ride quality, made long trips uncomfortable, further undermining the car's appeal as a sporty daily driver. Reliability issues compounded the Monza's frustrations. While the engines themselves were generally robust in isolation, the integration of those engines into the small chassis created multiple problems: overheating, premature wear on mounts, stressed transmissions, and recurring cooling system failures. The tight engine bay often led to neglected maintenance, accelerating wear and tear. Additionally, electrical and minor mechanical systems were prone to failure, and replacement parts could be hard to source due to the car's relatively short production run. Mechanics widely regarded the Monza as a nightmare to work on, especially when dealing with V8 models, which were the primary selling point yet caused the most headaches. Rust protection was minimal, as was common for mid-70s GM compacts, and the Monza's unibody design and thin sheet metal made corrosion a frequent problem. Wheel arches, floor pans, and rocker panels were particularly susceptible, especially in areas with salted roads or high humidity. Combined with its maintenance challenges, this made the Monza a car that required constant attention to remain functional, leaving many owners frustrated and mechanics annoyed. In terms of performance, the Monza underdelivered. While marketing promised a small, sporty car with V8 punch, the
The combination of heavy engines in a small chassis, marginal brakes, and mediocre suspension meant that acceleration was uneven, handling was sloppy, and overall driving experience fell short of the promise. Owners often joked that it felt fast in spirit, but slow in execution. And period reviews frequently noted that it was an American car attempting to be European, but failing in every measurable way. Ultimately, the Chevrolet Monza's legacy is one of disappointment wrapped in attractive sheet metal. It had all the trappings of a sporty compact, appealing coupe lines, a V8 option, and marketing that suggested excitement. Yet in reality, it was cramped, poorly built, mechanically frustrating, and difficult to maintain. It failed to capture the hearts of buyers seeking real performance or refinement, and it left mechanics shaking their heads at the effort required to service what should have been a simple, compact car. Today, surviving Monzas are rare, often kept by collectors fascinated more by the story of the car than by its driving experience.
The Lincoln Continental Mark IV, produced between 1972 and 1976, is one of the quintessential examples of 1970s American automotive excess. Enormous, luxurious, and stunning to behold, yet a staggering exercise in impracticality and bloated engineering. From its debut, the Mark IV was intended to exude prestige and opulence, a rolling palace on wheels for buyers who demanded presence, comfort, and status. On the surface, it succeeded beautifully. With its long formal hood, waterfall grille, hidden headlights, vinyl landau roof, and impossibly long rear deck, the Mark IV was the epitome of the look-at-me luxury car. Yet behind the glamorous sheet metal, the reality of driving and owning one was a far more frustrating, often exasperating experience. A barge masquerading as a car with all the drawbacks of its gargantuan size. Weight was perhaps the Mark IV's most obvious flaw. At nearly 5,000 pounds in base form and often tipping the scales even higher with optional equipment, it was one of the heaviest cars of the 1970s. Its colossal dimensions, nearly 230 inches long and 80 inches wide, made maneuvering in city streets, tight parking lots, or suburban driveways a trial. Drivers quickly discovered that its massive bulk required constant attention. Blind spots were enormous, steering effort was significant even with power assistance, and curb parking could be a nerve-wracking challenge. On highways, the Mark IV lumbered along with a boat-like gait. Its size imposing, but its agility non-existent. Lane changes demanded careful planning, and tight corners were handled with an alarming degree of body roll and understeer. Under the hood, the Mark IV's engines were similarly disappointing. Early models featured Ford's 460 cubic inch V8, a massive unit that theoretically produced impressive torque. However, the 1970s emissions regulations had taken their toll. Smog controls, catalytic converters, and increasingly stringent fuel economy standards choked power delivery. The advertised 365 horsepower in reality felt much lower, and the throttle response was lazy at best. Acceleration was slow for the car's weight, with 0 to 60 miles per hour times often stretching into the 10 to 12 second range for the larger fully optioned versions. Passing on two-lane highways was a calculated exercise, and even a full-throttle attempt at merging onto an interstate felt sluggish compared to lighter or better-tuned vehicles. Owners quickly learned that the Mark IV's V8 grunt existed more on paper than in practical dynamic performance. Handling was another glaring compromise. With a traditional live rear axle, soft coil springs, and a front suspension tuned entirely for ride comfort rather than cornering precision, the Mark IV handled like a luxury barge. Steering was vague and hydraulically assisted, providing little feedback, and body roll in turns was dramatic. Braking, despite power assistance, often felt inadequate for such a heavy machine, requiring long stopping distances and careful planning in traffic. Wet or slick roads magnified the car's shortcomings, and owners regularly reported nervous feelings during abrupt maneuvers or emergency stops. On the rare occasions when the Mark IV was driven enthusiastically, it was clear that this was a vehicle built for style and comfort rather than any engaging driving experience. Interiors were spacious and plush, but not immune to criticism. Leather seats, wood trim, and thick carpeting conveyed a sense of luxury, yet ergonomics were inconsistent. Controls were large and heavy, sometimes awkwardly placed, and visibility could be frustrating due to the car's enormous A-pillars and long hood. Air conditioning was almost mandatory in summer given the car's size and interior volume, yet early systems were prone to underperformance. Electrically operated features such as windows, seats, and seatbelt retractors were luxurious in concept, but often required maintenance, adding a layer of complexity to ownership. Storage and cabin practicality were minimal. Despite its size, the Mark IV's trunk was modest relative to the car's mass, and maneuvering luggage or groceries in and out could be cumbersome. Fuel consumption was predictably disastrous. With a thirsty 460 V8 and a vehicle weighing several tons, mileage rarely exceeded 10 to 12 miles per gallon in city driving, and highway figures rarely improved beyond 15 miles per gallon. Rising fuel prices in the 1970s only amplified this issue, making ownership increasingly expensive and contributing to the car's eventual reputation as a barge with beautiful styling but impractical day-to-day use. Reliability, though generally acceptable for Ford engineering of the time, was challenged by the car's sheer size and complexity. Maintenance on the massive V8, hydraulic systems, and heavily optioned electrical components was labor-intensive, and repairs were often more expensive due to the sheer scale of the parts involved. Owners occasionally reported sagging suspensions, leaking air conditioning components, and minor electrical quirks that required specialized attention. The car's size and weight exacerbated wear on tires, brakes, and chassis components, meaning preventative maintenance was essential to prevent early degradation. Despite its flaws, owners often remained enamored with the Mark IV's aesthetic presence. It was a car that projected success and status, and for many, the indulgence in luxury, space, and comfort outweighed the frustration of its slow acceleration, ponderous handling, and fuel consumption. Yet behind closed doors, many admitted that the car was exhausting to drive on a daily basis, particularly in congested urban environments. A 1970s car enthusiast once noted, "It's like piloting a small yacht through traffic, majestic, but exhausting if you actually have to steer it." By today's standards, the Lincoln Continental Mark IV is remembered less as a functional vehicle and more as a symbol of 1970s American automotive excess. Bold, luxurious, and visually commanding, yet profoundly impractical, bloated, and marginally competent on the road. It perfectly exemplifies an era when American manufacturers equated size, style, and luxury with desirability, often at the expense of performance, fuel economy, or driving engagement. Surviving examples are prized mostly by collectors and nostalgia enthusiasts, but they remain reminders that a car can look incredible, convey status, and still be fundamentally a cumbersome and challenging vehicle to drive.